The podcast is supported by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. Join us in celebrating America's 250th anniversary right here in Massachusetts. From the cobblestone streets of Boston to the shores of Cape Cod and the hills of the Berkshires, Massachusetts is where history comes to life. Whether you're standing where the American Revolution began or visiting Fenway Park, the oldest ballpark in America, you're exploring the stories that shaped our nation. Revolutions start here. Learn more at massachusetts250.org.
Massachusetts is in the middle of a push to build 222,000 new homes by 2035, and the gap between what's been built and what's needed remains frustratingly persistent. That's frustrating for residents, but it's also frustrating for policymakers who are trying to figure out what levers they can pull. At the same time, a statewide rent control ballot question is bearing down on Beacon Hill, federal fair housing protections are under assault, and the Healey administration is turning some surplus state land into housing at a pace that the Commonwealth so far has never attempted. Running the agency in the middle of all of this is a new secretary who has been on both sides of the lawmaking process. So I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. This week I am joined by Juana Matias, Secretary of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and we're talking about where the state's housing push stands, what she's watching now that she's back on Beacon Hill, and how the federal rollback of fair housing protections is landing here. So, all of that said, Secretary Matias, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to be back in my old stomping grounds. As you know, I was the former Chief Operating Officer for Mass Inc., so I'm delighted to be here and talk about all things housing.
Yes, as we were walking through, I was just assessing what looked familiar and what didn't look familiar about the office. So the podcast bunker didn't exist when you were here, but we are building new podcast bunkers and new housing.
Yes. And the office has not changed, is what we concluded. It is still the exact same office that I came to every single day while I was Chief Operating Officer. So delighted to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
And then on the housing world itself, you've worn a lot of hats. You were a state rep, HUD regional administrator, COO, obviously, at the place that we're sitting now, which has done a lot on kind of the housing front. So what is new to you about the secretary role here? Is it all just kind of mix and matching things that you've done before, or is there something that was very, very different?
Yeah, no, I think what's new, and especially coming from my time at HUD, being the regional administrator for the New England office, is it's a lot of incoming and a lot of more decision-making power in this position. At a time when housing is the top issue for the state and for the administration, with limited resources and headwinds federally that are making, deals penciling out much more difficult. But I think what's been promising and really reaffirming to me is, one, seeing our local partners stepping up and saying, how are we a part of the solution? Two, having a governor and lieutenant governor that really understand this issue and are willing to put not just policy but resources behind moving production, changing zoning, and making sure that we're making housing production easier across the state.
And when we talk about things like 222,000 units, that can be pretty hard for some people to get their heads around what that actually means. So when you think about how the housing crisis and the housing squeeze actually feels to kind of the average person, what are you trying to keep in mind? How do you explain sort of the stakes of the Massachusetts housing crisis to people?
Yeah, no, you've polled on this. The Massing Polling Group has polled on this. When we poll, we know that this is the number one issue for residents across the Commonwealth. We know that 52% of people in Massachusetts, renters specifically, are cost-burdening. They're spending about 30% of their income on just making their rent. And so this has real implications. We have teachers who want to live near where they work. We have elderly and older adults that want to age in place. We have working families that want to be able to set up roots. We saw in this poll that people between the ages of 35 and 44 want to purchase a home, want to remain in Massachusetts, but we haven't been developing housing at the rate we should have for decades. And this problem that we're currently facing wasn't built overnight. We're also not going to solve it overnight. But what I can assure people across the Commonwealth is that the administration, the Office of Housing and Livable Communities, has looked inwardly and at all levers that we could be pushing and making sure we're making the right investments. We are. We've seen that, right, with a capital investment plan that by the end of 2027, we will more than double investments in our housing production programs across affordable housing production. We've been innovative. We've rolled out through the Affordable Homes Act a commercial conversion tax credit provision. We increased housing development incentive program production under HDIP. And we continue to think about what else do we need to be doing around policy. We're really looking forward towards the end of the legislative session with the Mass Winds Economic Development Bill, be able to, say that we make some progress on site plan review. Also looking at making commercial conversion by right across the state. So there's more to do. We're doing a lot. We know this issue is impacting people's day-to-day decisions, but you could not have an administration, both the governor level and even at HLC, who's more committed to finding solutions.
So there was a lot in there. We're going to piece through a number of those things. So in case we don't have, the deep lore housing nerds here who remember all the way back to 2 years ago when the Affordable Homes Act, which was the sweeping bond bill, kind of went into effect here. One of the things that can sometimes be difficult, aside from kind of getting your head around the scale of the housing problem, is, a bond bill isn't specifically saying this is what we're spending. It's saying, this is the highest possible amount that we could be spending. A mass budget analysis found that only about 44% of the authorization has actually been budgeted. So how do you think about / try and deal with explaining kind of the gap between what we could do, what we are doing, and then things that don't necessarily just amount to dollars and cents?
Yeah, what I would say to that, Jen, is that we've doubled capital investment spending. So since 2023, we have 10,000 units in the pipeline for LIHTC. So we've increased. Are we using it to the full extent? No. I think a portion of this is understanding that when we're doing bonding, that is debt, and we need to be thoughtful in making sure that the way we leverage this resource is in the best interest of the state. But whether we're actually doing more, absolutely, right? Like we increased the Housing Development Incentive Program. I think it went from $30 million to $60 million. We created new revenue streams for programming that didn't exist, like the Momentum Fund, right? That Mass Housing oversees, and that's trying to close gaps in mixed income market rate deals across the Commonwealth and gateway cities. And so could we be doing more? Yes, and we're trying to. But I think people also need to be aware of the fact that we don't have infinite resources, right? We have a state budget, and this administration was very intentional from day one, saying, okay, we're going to stand up a secretariat so we could be intentional in thinking about this issue, make sure we're dedicating the resources, the capacity that this moment requires to really address housing in the way that it needs to be addressed. And that wasn't just standing up the secretariat, that was doing a landmark affordable homes bill that invested a tremendous amount of money, and we hope to continue to look at the provisions of that bill to make sure that we're implementing them to the full extent.
And one of those provisions is an interesting step toward making ADUs easier to build. So those are, for those who might know them by a few other names, that could be something like granny flats. They're often associated with having your in-laws living near you. But also, you might know them as accessory dwelling units, additional dwelling units, essentially small structures that can be built on the same property as another one. You can have kind of a family, another relative living kind of on that same property. And one of the things that the bond bill did was legalize these anywhere where we have single-family districts. So thinking about the progress on those so far, analysis of that has basically said we've had, an immediate uptick as soon as that legalization went into effect, but production still remains short of what's needed, partly because municipalities still have rooms to impose their own standards. So what does the state do about that?
Yeah, no, I think with ADUs, it's a positive story, Just this past year, we saw that we have 1,200 permits across the state, so there's clear interest. We understand that there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we've been working both with Mass Housing and the Mass Housing Partnership to think about what is it that we need to do to make sure that homeowners who are interested in having an ADU unit on site can really overcome some of the barriers that come with that. Our ADU Design Challenge was one of the things that we rolled out a couple of weeks ago. These are ADU designs, free of cost online that homeowners can leverage. MHP is currently working to finalize in the next couple of weeks some technical assistance that we will be able to provide to homeowners. So if you're interested in having an ADU on site, site plan review, what's feasible, what's not feasible. We're going to have consultants that people will be able to leverage through MHP to get that early pre-development work done. And then Mass Housing just recently also rolled out a loan product, where if you're interested in building an ADU and you meet certain income brackets for Mass Housing programming, you're able to leverage $250,000 for a detached unit, $150,000 for an attached unit. And we understand that there are still barriers. When you implement policy, it's an iterative process. So we've heard from communities on the ground, towns and cities and mayors around, well, what does this mean around septic? What does this mean around utility hookups? You guys weren't very clear. And so we're in the process of drafting ADU regulations. The Division of Livable Communities hopes to have updated ADU regulations by the end of the summer. And we want to do a lot more around ADUs. The permits are a great early indicator that people are interested and that this could be a vehicle to build a lot more units that support older adults that want to age in place, that support intergenerational families. And we're currently thinking in-house at HLC about what other loan products or funding could exist that help us supercharge ADUs across the Commonwealth.
And this kind of gets at one of these sort of classic Massachusetts tensions that, of course, you're familiar with as a former state rep, which is the local control of it all, the home rule of it all here. Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll noted recently when talking about a housing legislative package that, local autonomy is great, but not if it means, I think her words were, not the autonomy to just refuse to build more homes. And we've seen that kind of in practice, or what that tension has looked like around MBTA communities, which, as folks note, and I'm sure you will, that most communities have complied with. However, plenty have dragged their feet along the way. It has sort of become a fight about what the role and the split is between the state and local power. And so I'm curious, as you step into this role, thinking back to your role as a state rep, where has local control kind of overstepped? Where has it worked out well? What would you like to sort of see and experiment with going forward?
Yeah, no, Jen, I think that's an important point. But I want to say that the MBTA law is a clear example of something that's working. Since it's been enacted, we have 9,000 units in the pipeline. Right? By standardizing zoning through the MBTA law around transit, we've been able to create 9,000 units. 1,500 of those will be affordable. And I would say sometimes I think we focus really on outliers, on certain communities that have dragged their feet, who we've had disagreements with. But the vast majority of communities and partners locally have been great partners and have worked with the state to understand, okay, what are the requirements? How do we help us? Because when we talk about these 222,000 units, we're not just talking about housing. We're talking our ability to remain a competitive state. We're talking about workforce implications for Massachusetts. We're talking about making sure that the quality of life for residents remains central to everything we do. And so I want to kind of highlight the fact that, yes, there are outliers that push back and don't necessarily come to the table agreeably, but the vast majority...
And do bring suit to the state's highest court. We should acknowledge that the pushback is pretty profound in some cases.
Yeah, and when we see litigation, we're disappointed because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is address a concern for residents, and that concern is cost of housing is extremely high. People are struggling to find a place to call home. We're seeing the high cost of rents and homes pushing people out, and that's not good for our state. So I think, when we go into these discussions knowing that that is our North Star and what it is that we're trying to do, we can find consensus. And, when we find communities that disagree with us, we're going to always continue to have an open door policy. We want to collaborate and work with you. And like the Lieutenant Governor has said, we are not going to, we know that our mandate is to ensure that Massachusetts remains competitive and that people can continue to have their roots here and have a thriving families. So.
And so the State Lands for Home Act here is one of these more sort of concrete things that the administration can do. I think the estimate is, around 700 acres at various stages of development, somewhere around there. Correct me if I'm wrong. So walk me through kind of what this actual program is and then how quickly this can actually bring homes online. Because again, 222,000 units, it's a pretty high bar.
Yeah, no, State Land for Homes was another provision of the Affordable Homes Act. It looks at underutilized state land, whether it's, old hospitals, parking lots that are not being utilized to capacity. And the purpose of this provision is to really take these lands that are not on tax rolls and repurpose them for housing, much needed housing. We have the potential of 5,600 units in the pipeline to date, and we're working as quickly as possible, right? This is, again, there's a process locally. You're working with the state entity that holds the land to understand what their needs are. Then you're working with the town officials to understand what are your priorities, what are your concerns, how do we reach consensus around what we hope to accomplish. But we think this is an important lever that also could do what we've seen with the MBTA law, and that is, generate new housing production in a state where we don't have much land available. And so it's been promising to see to date what we've been able to accomplish. We're still really in the early stages. It's just been a year since this was enacted, and the 5,600 units we've reported out to date. But I think more to come, and I think it's going to be promising.
I'm so curious too, because as kind of a housing development reporter wonk for most of my career, the different metrics that different groups use to kind of figure out what's working, are things working at the speed that you'd like to see. Like permitting is often used as sort of kind of an optimistic impression of the homes that you could end up getting, because it's saying, these are ones that have kind of crossed that first threshold, but it doesn't address, construction costs or something like that. So when you're at EOHLC and thinking about what is a program that's working, what needs tuning, what metrics are you looking at? What's helpful to you to figure that out?
I mean, data, right? I come from Mass Inc., and we know that data and evidence-based research is really important in helping us make decisions and helping us, understand where investments should be going. The ADU example is a perfect one of us saying, all right, what does, after we've enacted this provision, what does ADU permitting look across the state? And that took our data and research team calling 351 communities across the Commonwealth to get that data. It's an iterative process. When we think about the housing system, it's not just on the state. Like we mentioned at the top of this conversation, right? We're talking about financing partners. We're talking about localities and the intricacies that come with that. We're talking about federal headwinds. We're talking about developers. It's an entire ecosystem, and it's multifaceted, and it's about making sure we're talking to all of these sectors to ensure that we have a right pulse of what's working, what's not working, and then that when it's not working or we're missing the mark, how are we pivoting internally at HLC to update regulations, to think about how we're investing, to think about new programming. And so we're nimble, and we're constantly looking at data, whether it's we're driving, getting that information, or getting it from our partners to help inform decision making.
And one of the things that happened in the last 24 hours that everybody in the housing universe has had to deal with is kind of the rent control question right now. There is a ballot question that looks like it has the signatures needed to make it to the ballot that would impose one of the strictest standards of rent control in the entire country, here in Massachusetts, statewide. There have been efforts at and some movement toward compromise proposals that might keep that off the ballot if the legislature has an appetite to it. I guess kind of at a fundamental first level, Governor Healey has said that she is opposed to rent control, generally speaking, or worried about the impacts of rent control on housing production, but over the weekend said that she is open to some sort of compromise if it might keep it off the ballot. Where is HLC in that conversation?
Yeah, I think the administration has been very clear that, we oppose the ballot as written because the administration has been focused on one thing, lowering costs. And the way you lower housing costs is by spurring production as quickly as possible. However, as you've seen, there have been new developments over the last couple of days, and the governor has been very clear that she'd like to see a compromise to avert this badly written ballot initiative. And so The administration has not taken a stance on one compromise over the other. I think we're going to wait to see where the legislature lands. Once that compromise reaches the governor's desk, she will review it and make a decision on it. But we think the focus really needs to be on production. And as written, the ballot initiative really halts production in a hurtful way.
And so the legislature has until July 1st to act on this if they want to before the second round of signatures is due. As a former rep, you know how end of session dynamics end up playing out. We are right at the end of the 2-year term. We have 2 weeks left until that sort of deadline around ballots. Truly speaking from your background here, is there a realistic path? Is there a version of rent control that could come out of this that EOHLC could live with? I understand that there's no specific commitment, but thinking about that scramble toward the end of session, this is a pretty big policy change.
Yeah, I think, look, there are high stakes on the line, and I'm optimistic that the legislature understands what these high stakes are. I think the administration is optimistic, and if we're hoping that we get to see something on the governor's desk for her to consider. I think it's in the best interest of everyone.
And then beyond rent control, what else on the housing front this session is exciting, is not? I know you don't get to deal with anything until it's been made law, and that little provision in there says EOHLC is in charge of regulations, but what else would you like to see come to fruition, or what are you watching?
Yeah, mass wins, our site plan review provision there.
So explain that to those who might not know what site plan
so
provision
currently,
means.
We don't have a standard system in the state under Chapter 48 around site plan review. So 351 communities have their own processes and timelines, and that can, delay production around housing. It could create a lot of insecurity for developers. And so what we want to do is standardize what site plan review should look like with a 90-day timeline. And so that's within the Mass Wins economic development bill. We'd hope that comes out favorably. We think that would, again, do a little bit what we've seen with some of our other provisions like the MBTA law and ADUs, standardization, creating, some expectations of what people and developers should know around housing development locally. And then the other provision is our commercial conversion tax credit, opt-in by right zoning and mixed use also included in that. We've seen some very interesting projects in Worcester and Boston around a commercial conversion tax credit. It was just in Worcester, 198 units coming, and we think there's a lot more potential for localities to look at old strip malls, in sites that are not being really utilized correctly, office spaces, and reconvert them into housing.
And so it's a different proposed ballot measure. Everyone's doing housing policy through ballot measure this year. But there is another one that's looking at making it easier to build starter homes on small lots. It runs into one of the issues that you brought up around ADUs, which is kind of septic access, what it means to kind of make it easier to build housing in places that might not necessarily have all of the systems in place that you might like. It would allow it on 5,000 square feet lots as long as there is access to public sewer and water. But, and I'm going to keep this kind of a broad question here, is you talked about how Massachusetts has kind of limited land space. So when you're thinking about kind of where you can put homes that are oriented towards sort of either younger families who are struggling to stay here or older residents who might want to downsize, how are you thinking about creative ways to not just use state land, but to find more efficient uses of the land that does exist?
Yeah, no, look, with the starter home ballot initiative, the administration has not taken a position on it, but the intent of the law is something we agree with, right? We're constantly thinking about what else we could be doing to build density and to get to that 222,000 number. That's just about meeting demand. Currently, we were just yesterday or 2 days ago in Reframe, a modular construction company, and they were saying, your ADU regulations didn't talk about whether it could be a 2-floor ADU. Are you guys opposed to that? Is that something the state is willing to consider? We're open to it, right? We want to make sure that we're building all types of housing so that people of all income brackets can continue to call Massachusetts home. And, and we were willing to consider and look at distinct provisions that allow us to get to that number.
And so thinking about one of the other hats that you wore, which is HUD Regional Administrator, there have been some pretty substantial changes to the way that HUD has approached either DEI initiatives or fair housing initiatives. What's been lost currently at HUD under the administration, and how has that impacted Massachusetts in your view?
Yeah, I mean, we were just impacted a couple of weeks ago when it comes to fair housing. We know they've rolled back their investments and their protections around the Fair Housing Act. Luckily, we've stepped up. The Affordable Homes Act stood up the Fair Housing Office within the Office of HLC. We just rolled out $1 million across the Commonwealth to distinct nonprofit organizations that are, here to prevent discrimination, are here to ensure that people continue to have access to housing. And so that's one real way where we're seeing the federal government disinvest in things where we should be investing. And, from my time at HUD and now being at HLC, I know that one of the things that we lost greatly, not just in Massachusetts, but across the region, is the institutional knowledge of public servants, right? It seems like forever ago, but we dismantled an entire agency, and we're continuing to see them not just roll back fair housing protection recently. I think just as early as last week, seeing them disinvest in our continuum of care, which provides permanent supportive housing for some of our neediest populations across the state. And that causes significant turmoil here in the state, right? Our budget is only infinite. We cannot say that we're going to assume the gaps that the federal government is creating, and so it's a challenging time when we should see the federal government reinvesting and investing more in the issue that is not the top issue of Massachusetts, but the issue of our time across the country. But we're going to continue to work with our housing partners, the legislature, those on the ground to think about what can we do as we continue to see the federal government step back.
And related to that, but a little bit off the wall, I was talking to someone this morning, and they mentioned, of course, being interested in kind of what does public housing look like as a priority right now. Some of the Affordable Homes Act provisions, we're looking at, restoring the quality around existing public housing projects. But in this sort of era of federal disinvestment with limited state resources, is there interest in expanding public housing options? What does that basically look like?
I mean, what you saw in the Affordable Homes Act was we know that our public housing stock has not been invested in terms of capital investments at the rate that it should be. So there was an allocation of funding to make sure that we're doing that. I was just in Worcester, and it was such an incredible project to see, right? Taking Curtis Apartments and redeveloping it into state-of-the-art, modernized, dignified housing, and we'd love to continue to see that happen at scale. I think the federal partner was a key partner in that, and so as they're rolling back Faircloth, that makes that path unlikely. But there are resources within HLC where we want to make sure that we're leveraging them and getting our public housing stock, which, the majority of people who live in that, 70% are older adults, to make sure that they're aging in place and with quality. We have not taken on the idea of building new public housing. One of the things that I learned very quickly at my time at HUD, that you shouldn't concentrate poverty. I think sometimes when you do public housing or predominantly public housing, you concentrate poverty, and that has huge implications on the people that live there, their networks, what they have access to. Hence why the federal government moved to the housing choice voucher format, where people can take a voucher and decide and choose where they want to live and go to high opportunity areas. And so more to come. I mean, I think we're open to considering all vehicles in terms of how we can drive production, but that hasn't been at the forefront. Our focus has really been in recapitalizing our current public housing, because this is about preservation, right? It's not just about production. How are we keeping every unit we have that is affordable in our portfolio and not losing them?
And I think we're going to end pretty much where we started, which is, we need 222,000 homes by 2035. That's not actually that far away at this point. 9 years feels long, but I think as anyone who remembers, how long ago, college or high school or you go back, it seems like it's kind of a very, very short trip here. So given everything we've talked about, pace of bond spending, the specific kind of responsibility or opportunities in local municipalities, federal headwinds, rent control fights playing out in real time here. Do we get there? Do we get there reasonably on schedule, or do we have to recalculate?
I think we do. And I think in the coming weeks, we are going to have some data coming out of HLC that we're still kind of fine-tuning that shows that we're not just on par to our goals. We may be, a little ahead. And so I think we do get there. And, the way I measure success is making sure that that teacher, that police officer has a place to live that's near work, that older adult has a place to age in place, and that young family who is between the age of 35 and 44 and wants to remain in Massachusetts can do so. That's how we measure success, and I can assure you that you have a team at HLC and you have an administration that every single day is looking inwardly to think about what we could be doing more.
Okay, well, thank you again to Secretary Juana Matias for joining me on the podcast. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email podcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We will be back in your ears next week.